Hi guys, my name is Mr. Gonzalez and I'll be helping teach you music theory. In today's lesson, we will go over the staff, notes, and pitch. The main objective of this lesson is to be able to identify the 5 lines and 4 spaces of the staff, as well as being able to identify higher or lower pitch. Let's get started. Music is written on a staff of 5 lines and the 4 spaces between. Music notes are oval-shaped symbols that are placed on the lines and in the spaces. They represent musical sounds called pitch. The lines of the staff are numbered from bottom to top. Line 1, line 2, line 3, line 4, and line 5. The spaces between the lines are also numbered from bottom to top. Space 1, space 2, space 3, and space 4. If notes appear higher on the staff, they sound higher in pitch. If notes appear lower on the staff, they sound lower in pitch. Let's take a look at these 2 notes right here. This first note is on the second line, and then this note is on the third space. We can see that the second note is higher than the first note. When we are comparing pitch, we are always comparing 2 notes. We will be looking at the second note to determine whether if it is higher or lower than the first. So in this case, the second note is higher. Let's take a look at these 2. Our first note is on the third space. Our second note is on the second space. We can see from here to here, the second note is lower. Let's look here. We have a note on the second space, and we have a note on the first line. The second note is lower than the first note. Over here, we have a note on the first line and a note on the fourth space. We can see from the second note to the first note, we have jumped up quite a bit up the staff. So our second note is higher. Next, we have a note on the fourth space and a note on the third space. By looking at the second note, we can see that it is lower than the first. So our note will be lower. Lastly, let's look at these 2 notes. Our first note is on the third space, and our second note is on the first space. Our second note is lower than our first note. Let's look at some exercises here. For our first exercise, we are going to put an X on the location indicated by our instruction. Let's take a look. Here we need to put an X on the third line. So let's count. Line 1, line 2, line 3. Here we will be putting an X on space 2. So let's count. Space 1, space 2. Next, we will be putting an X on line 1. This one's pretty easy. We go to our first line, and that's where our X goes. Here, we will be putting an X on space 4. Let's count. Space 1, space 2, space 3, and space 4. Lastly, we will put an X on line 5. Line 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. For our next set of exercises, we will be putting an O on the line or space indicated. Let's take a look. Our first one here is asking for an O on the fourth space. Let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4. When you are placing your O, please make sure that the center is either in the space or on the line. Here, we will put an O on the first line. This one's easy. Line 1. Next, we will put an O on space 2. Let's count. Space 1, space 2. Here, we will place an O on line 3. Let's count. 1, 2, 3. Lastly, we need an O on space 1. This one's also easy. Space 1. For our last exercise, indicate whether the second note is higher or lower than the first note by using H for higher or L for lower. Let's get started. Let's take a look at our first two notes. We have a note on the second space and a note on the third line. Our second note is higher than the first note. For our next example, we have a note on the third space and a note on the first space. The second note is lower than the first note. In our next example, our first note is on the third line, and our second note is on the fifth line. Our second note is higher than our first note. For this example, our first note is on the second line, and our second note is on the second space. Our second note is higher than our first note. And for our last example, our first note is on the second line, and our second note is on the first line. Our second note is lower than our first note. And that's it for today's lesson, guys. I hope you feel more confident in your abilities to identify the lines and the spaces of the staff, as well as being able to identify if a pitch is higher or lower in sound. In our next lesson, we will be looking at the treble clef.